and welcome everyone to Vito's house, which is also Thai Lab, which is a squat. You are currently standing inside of one of those illegal Hong Kong rooftop houses. Okay, so we run it for 11 years now as an art space. We do a lot of talks, we do a lot of screenings, performances. You can find our activities. And today, Gabriel is going to share a super interesting train of thought and theory that is really not common in Hong Kong. But we thought that it would be urgent to place Hong Kong within that theory because of its interesting history and its interesting present. So I hope this dialogue between Gabriel's theory and Hong Kong goes well tonight, and feel free to participate. I hope that after the talk there can be a very fruitful exchange. I know what I want to ask, I know what I want to take out of this, but please feel free. Okay? So without further ado, Gabriel Rockhill.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Alberto, for organizing this, and I'm very honored to be here and looking forward to a rich conversation. I have, in my professorial ways, prepared a quite detailed talk, but given the intimacy of the space and the nature of it, I think what I'd like to do is kind of talk through some of the basic problematics with you and develop, including with Vito here, an organic conversation around it. So if there are things that interpolate you and you'd like to get into the conversation, we can always start the discussion period earlier rather than later. The basic framework of what I wanted to share with you is, on the one hand, an analysis of Western Marxism, how best to understand it as an ideological product of imperialism, and I'll unpack what I mean by that. But then, secondly, how Western Marxism has provided one of the dominant frameworks for understanding art, and more specifically radical art, and how it relates to politics. But that framework I find woefully insufficient at a number of levels, both theoretical and practical. And so by journeying through Western Marxism and understanding it, recognizing the framework that it uses in order to analyze art and culture more generally, because it's not just art, but it's culture in the broad sense of the term, meaning both art and theory and other kind of cultural elements in broader society, we will then be able to come full circle and hopefully recognize that the Western Marxist approach to art and politics does not center the principal contradiction of the contemporary world, which is imperialism, and they do not understand the fight against imperialism, which is, slowly but surely, in fits and starts, giving birth to an alternative system, which is socialism. And so in that regard, I think we really have to frame all of this in terms of a world historical battle, which is that of imperialism versus socialism. So the first thing I want to say about Western Marxism is that it is not the same thing as Marxism in the West. Instead, it is a particular version of Marxism that, for very material reasons, developed in the imperial core. The imperial core, of course, is kind of Western Europe. The United States is the leading imperialist power today. But then there are a lot of junior partners, from Canada to Australia to, for that matter, Japan, South Korea, etc. And within that imperial core, there developed what I refer to, and again, I'll unpack this jargon, but I think it's jargon that's helpful, an imperial superstructure. What I mean by that is that a socioeconomic system like capitalism produces a political and legal system, mainly bourgeois democracies within the imperial core, but it also produces a broader cultural apparatus, meaning a system for cultural production, distribution, and consumption. But all of that, meaning the bourgeois art world and the cultural world, is ultimately rooted within the socioeconomic base, within the capitalist world. In that regard, the superstructure is both of these things. It's the political legal system and the cultural apparatus that are rooted in the socioeconomic base. Western Marxism, then, is in many ways a product of the cultural superstructure that is a consequence of imperialism. Meaning, let me unpack that a little bit, that the history of imperialism, I'm using this term very generally. Imperialism is the socioeconomic system by which the overwhelming majority of the planet has been underdeveloped. Its resources have been stolen, its labor has been stolen, and it's been used for markets for offloading goods. Meaning, primarily, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, historically. In order to have all that value, all the natural resources, all the cheap or free labor driven towards the imperial core, and more specifically to the capitalist ruling class within the imperial core. That overall system has meant that within the imperial core, you have much more developed cultural apparatus than elsewhere in the world. Right? At some level, this is very simple. If you go to underdeveloped regions in Africa, you compare them to the Rockefeller-run institutions, art institutions in New York City, and you see very clearly who has resources and who does not. Those resources aren't accidental, though. They come from the entire history of the underdevelopment of the majority of the planet for the superdevelopment of the imperial core. Within that imperial superstructure, though, there's also a version of Marxism that has emerged. And this is why it's important to diagnose what Western Marxism is. It is a very specific form of Marxism that arose within this cultural apparatus of the imperial core, whose primary characteristic is that it does not grasp the principal contradiction or the struggle to overcome. The principal contradiction is imperialism, meaning it's the conflict between the imperial core and the colonized and semi-colonized periphery. The conflict between the underdeveloped regions of the world, the tricontinent, Asia, Africa, and Latin America principally, and the imperial core. It's that contradiction that defines the geostrategic world that we live in. If you do not grasp that, then you've missed the last 5 centuries of history. That is what Western Marxism does not grasp, for some specific material reasons that I'll get into. But that relationship has also been one in which there's been struggle, resolute class struggle, around the world against this world historical system. Principally led by those in the global south, what we used to call the third world, who are not satisfied with being the slaves of empire. And those people have taken it upon themselves to break the chains of empire and begin building, in fits and starts with many contradictions and complications, socialism. Because what socialism does, among many other things, is it resolves the principal contradiction. It overcomes the underdevelopment of the periphery for the benefit of the imperial core. Everybody can, yeah, you good? In that regard, then, this is the core driving mechanism. It's the history of global class struggle over the last 5 centuries. Western Marxism doesn't understand this and doesn't center imperialism and socialism. The reason for that is, there are many reasons for it, but the principal reason is that in the history of Western Marxism, what you have is a form of Marxism that, as I mentioned, arises within this cultural apparatus in the imperial core, but it has been very specifically supported by bourgeois states, meaning the political, legal superstructure, and by the capitalist ruling class. Why, you might ask, would someone like the Rockefellers or the Fords, right, some of the most powerful capitalists in the history of the world, who have managers who run their foundations, who are the most elite trained, highly paid foundation managers, why would they support Marxism? If Marxism is a revolutionary theory premised on the goal of overthrowing capitalism. You have an answer to it, great.
You want to create an enemy to focus on, so you don't have to, so you distract people from their own welfare, because you create an imaginary enemy. I'm sorry, that's...
Yeah. Well, an imaginary enemy, but the issue with Marxism is that it has been the principal, theoretical, and practical weapon of class struggle of the peoples of the third world. If you look historically at where anti-imperialist revolutions have fought and won around the world, it is almost across the board those that have embraced Marxism as the theory and weapon of struggle. This causes a fundamental problem historically, and the imperialists know this. They're very well educated. And the problem is that Marxism has a magnetic pull for those who want to break the chains of imperialism. Historically it has. We can get up to the contemporary conjuncture in which there are some elements due to this history that make that slightly different. What that means is that if Marxism is prevalent within culture in general, one of the things that the imperialists face is how can you allow for Marxism to exist while defanging it, neutering it, to such an extent that it doesn't have the effects that you want it to have in the world. Meaning, a Marxism that is a Marxism in theory that has no consequence in practice. A Marxism that becomes a consumer product, that is trendy, that is fashionable, that sells itself as radical, but actually has no teeth, has no organic connection to working class struggles around the world, and therefore can be sold as a commodity. And you can do with Marxism the exact same thing that capital has done with everything else in the world. You commodify it, you make it into a consumer product, and you package it in such a way that people buy a radicality that actually has no purchase on the material world. In other words, what Western Marxism is it's a Marxism devoid of what Lenin called the revolutionary core of Marxism. It's practical purchase on changing the world, not just interpreting. So this is the principal reason why the leading robber barons of the capitalist ruling class in the United States directly funded Western Marxism, and the US state has supported versions of Western Marxism, particularly in the form that it takes in kind of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, figures like Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Herbert Marcuse, and others. This has created a situation such that then this type of Marxism is a Marxism that turns generally against political and economic analysis in favor of cultural analysis. So you no longer do political economy, you just focus on the analysis of culture. You no longer do an analysis of imperialism, or if you do, you misunderstand what imperialism is, and you blame imperialism on the socialists, for instance, and you say that, well, it's the socialists who are imperialists. So you misapprehend this fundamental contradiction. And thirdly, you reject actually existing socialism, more or less across the board. It's quite an incredible feat to be a self-declared Marxist and to say, I am opposed to any form of actually existing socialism because it does not live up to the purity of my principles and my image of what socialism should be. So it's an anti-communist Marxism. That's what Western Marxism is in its essence. That has been very salable and marketable within the imperial core because it's promoted by these forces, the capitalist ruling class and bourgeois state managers, but it also tends to plug in very easily with what we can refer to as the kind of intellectual labor aristocracy. Meaning, a labor aristocracy, as Engels and then Lenin theorized it, is that if you look at the entire globe and labor relations within the kind of planetary scope, then the workers in the imperial core, Europe, the United States, they are, compared to workers in the colonial periphery, they have historically been paid more, and they benefit, directly or indirectly, from imperialism, from the underdevelopment of the rest of the world. This has created what they call the labor aristocracy. And it's one of the reasons that a lot of the working class in the United States and Western Europe is relatively conservative. They have, on numerous occasions, rejected the support of revolutionary struggles in the Third World in order to support imperialism. You see this very clearly. In fact, one of the most recent strikes in the United States, it's a massive strike, but the workers did not strike over the delivering of arms. So they continued to allow US arms sales to happen, right? Which is one of the driving mechanisms behind US-led imperialism. In this regard, that's what the labor aristocracy is. The intellectual labor aristocracy is the class of intellectuals, the intelligentsia writ large, academics, journalists, art critics, all of those who are part of the broader intelligentsia in the imperial core. The material conditions of their existence are generally far superior to those within the imperial periphery due to the historical underdevelopment of those regions of the world. That class segment, what we can call the kind of middle stratum between the ownership class and the general working class, is pinched between two phenomena, right? One is the capitalist ruling class for whom they work, and the other is the general mass of workers who they're tasked with managing, by managing their minds, by engaging in basic ideological, coercion in various ways. That layer has historically been very unstable, meaning it can go in either direction. There are members of this kind of petty bourgeois intelligentsia who align on workers' struggles and want to support them and use their elite training in order to do that. But there's another segment that just aligns themselves directly on the capitalist ruling class. People like Francis Fukuyama, Samuel Huntington, they have no illusions. I mean, they're state operatives anyway. In fact, it was revealed that Samuel Huntington worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. He's a direct ideologue of U.S. empire. But there are also those members of this intellectual labor aristocracy who want to try to have it both ways. They want to appear radical, as if they're on the side of the people and the struggles of working people around the world. But at the end of the day, they have a very comfortable position because they're pitched at they're positioned at the very top of international labor pyramid in which the material conditions of their lives profit from imperialism. Why would you want to change that? Someone like Slavoj Žižek, the epitome of a Western Marxist, although using the term Marxism to refer to him is a bit slanderous in relationship to Marxism, but here's someone who is at the absolute pinnacle of the bourgeois cultural apparatus and the imperial superstructure that I was talking about before, who wants to appear radical. The last thing in the world that he would want is for all of his prowess and all his prominence within the capitalist world to disappear, right? And so that phenomenon produces a kind of figure of the radical recuperator. Intellectuals who want to posture as radical, appear radical, they put flames on the covers of their books, they'll hammers and sickles and fists in the air and all of these types of things, right? You know what I'm talking about. But the real, exactly, and so on and so on and so on. But the real goal is to recuperate potentially insurgent elements of the broader population within a capitalist accommodationist, if not an imperialist project. And that is precisely why they're so well paid and they're so widely promoted within the bourgeois cultural apparatus. This is important because the critique of Western Marxism cannot and never should be simply a critique of individuals, like Zizek or other manifestations of Western Marxism. Adorno and Horkheimer, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, these are Western Marxists. But what's important about them is not actually their individual contribution, if there is much of a contribution to speak of. What's important about them is that they're symptoms of a broader cultural system of production, distribution, and consumption. An attempt to make Marxism into a packaged, commodified good that appears radical but has no teeth, that looks like it serves anti-imperialist ends, but is ultimately just a red-covered pill that is indoctrinating you into anti-communism and at least accommodationism in relationship to imperialism. This is one of the quintessential elements that someone like Domenico Losordo has diagnosed, and part of my own work is drawing on his own research, then teasing out the broader political economy of intellectual production and cultural production within the core. Because if we're serious about doing Marxist analysis, which is historical and dialectically materialist, then you can't just look at individual manifestations. You have to move from the particular to the universal. From individual instances in which there's a clear pattern. In my own case, I was trained in French theory, German-style critical theory, Western Marxism, and I read very seriously each of these individuals. And then I started to see a pattern. I said, well, why are they all so hostile to socialism in the real world? And then I started to track it. I was like, is this systematic? Is it every single time that Marxism has an impact in the real world that they'll reject it? And it is almost 100% systematic. There are few minor exceptions that could be easily explained, but there's a pattern to it. And that pattern doesn't emerge by individual minds miraculously coming upon the same thing. The pattern emerges when we reverse our understanding of cultural production. Instead of starting from the individual as the creative fount of cultural production, you need to look at the system of cultural production that produced one individual, two individuals, many individuals, and put them in a system that conditioned their cultural production and drove it in a particular direction. So what we need is a systemic analysis of Western Marxism that's rooted in a political economy of cultural production, circulation, and consumption. And when you frame things in that regard, then I think it becomes crystal clear what we're dealing with, and that is a system of cultural production that is attempting to ideologically indoctrinate as many people as possible into the belief that real Marxism, authentic Marxism, is anti-communist and accommodates, if not supports, imperialism. One or two quick examples on this, just as fodder for the broader conversation, in case this sounds a bit abstract. Someone like Herbert Marcuse, right, who is known as the godfather of the New Left. He was an enormous media figure in the late 1960s, early 1970s. Known as a kind of radical who was in the forefront of the anti-war movement, the anti-racist movement, the feminist movement, the ecological movement. If you chase out his history, he happened to work for well over a decade for the US National Security State, working for the Office of Strategic Services, which is the predecessor organization of the Central Intelligence Agency, and then for the US State Department. In a lot of his later interviews, he downplayed this work. He said, well, I was just doing research on fascism in Germany, how to fight it, and we had no relationship to the Central Intelligence Agency. We were just invested in an anti-fascist struggle. We now know from the archival record that I and others have unearthed that that's not the case. He was working, as his job description at the US State Department in a 1948 document clearly states, with the Central Intelligence Agency. And he had his hand in the drafting of at least 2 national intelligence estimates, which are the highest form of intelligence for the US government, meaning the highest form of intelligence for the leading empire in the world. So here's a figure who's one of the leading figures of Western Marxism, who was not only a state operative involved directly in the forms of intelligence that fed into US imperialism, but moreover, he had a very close relationship with the Rockefeller Foundation that funded what they called the Marxism-Leninism Project. And the goal of the Marxism-Leninism Project was to fund research into Marxism-Leninism, meaning the form of Marxism that supports and is the driving force behind actually existing socialism, in order to shore up a version of Marxism that was opposed to it. Right? It wasn't called, within the internal documents at the time, Western Marxism, but what this basically means is that the Rockefeller Foundation, via figures like Herbert Marcuse, was directly funding the project of developing Western Marxism as an ideological weapon of war against Marxism-Leninism. Marcuse was not only at the center of this project, but worked with a number of figures, and we could get into this in the conversation. Philip Mosley is one of them. Philip Mosley is not very well known today, but he was a major academic who was a long-time, high-level CIA advisor involved in the Princeton group. The Princeton group brought together high-level academics in order to consult with the head of the CIA, Allen Dulles, and national security state operatives in order to develop national intelligence estimates. He was a close personal friend of Herbert Marcuse, one of his biggest academic supporters, and they would regularly dine together. This is one of the things that we need to know about how Western Marxists spend their time and the people that they frequent. It demonstrates as well that Western Marxism, in addition to being driven by the socioeconomic base and a kind of product of imperialism, also is something that has been directly supported by ideological forces on the part of the state. Any questions or comments about this thus far? Otherwise, I was going to transition into and link this to some of the issues of art and politics.
I think you go on.
Go on? Okay. I will do that. So one of actually the final thing that I'll say is the reason that it's important to criticize Western Marxism is not because they're theoretically wrong, or because one wants to theoretically grandstand and kind of laugh at, and we should snicker at people like Zizek and others, which I have done and I'm happy to indulge in. But at the end of the day, the real purpose of that type of critique is so that one can engage in outlining what the positive project is. Critique for its own sake leads nowhere, except for perhaps to someone patting themselves on the back for being right that someone else is wrong. But the whole point of critique is that you have a positive project, and that the positive project is rooted in real material and practical change. And so the critique of Western Marxism that Lasordo puts forth, that Jennifer Ponce de Leon and I in the introduction that we wrote to Lasordo's book put forth, is a critique that is rooted in understanding anti-imperialist Marxism as the kind of beating heart of the global struggle against imperialism. And it's that framing that has to be at the center of the struggle against Western Marxism, meaning recognizing that the struggle to build socialism is extremely difficult, there are many contradictions, it is fraught with problems, but it has enormous successes under its belt, and it is the principal way in which humanity has fended off imperial forces. So it's the inversion of the principal ideology of Western Marxism, anti-communist and imperialist and accommodationist, that forms the kind of beating heart of the positive project. If you want to be anti-imperialist, then you have to recognize that the real material struggle against imperialism has been socialist state-building projects in the global south. That I just wanted to highlight, but then if we relate everything that I've said thus far to the question of art and culture, I think that the way that a lot of Western Marxism approaches this question is that they bracket the materialist analysis of culture in favor of what I would refer to as a kind of cultural commodity fetishism. Commodity fetishism, if you're familiar with it, consists in you fetishize a commodity. You have a computer or a new phone or whatever, a cap that you love, and you become so enamored with it that it takes on this magical quality. You have to have the latest iPhone or whatever it might be, and in fetishizing it, you ignore all of the social relations that have produced that commodity. You don't see the slave labor that has extracted the natural resources from Africa or other parts of the world. You don't see the cheap labor that has in the assembly plants and all of the sweatshops. You don't see all of the labor that has gone into this commodity. You just isolate it and it stands on its own as a fetishized kind of magical element. If you look at what the Western Marxists have done in their analysis of art and culture, they generally engage in cultural commodity fetishism. They do not seriously analyze the system of cultural production, distribution, and consumption, particularly when it comes to high art and high theory. Some of them do it when it comes to the art that has been imposed upon the working masses as forms of entertainment. So for instance, Adorno and Horkheimer write critically of the culture industry. Right? And the culture industry is primarily that industry that produces a form of culture for the masses. But they never apply that critique to themselves, meaning they don't have an analysis of the theory industry, of which they are a part. And they certainly do not have a critical account of the materialist system of production of high art, of bourgeois art. Because on the contrary, and this is one of the remarkable feats of Western Marxism, it's precisely bourgeois art that they tend to focus on. It's bourgeois art that is purportedly the site of resistance and refusal to capitalist social relations. When you think about this, it's a rather odd proposition. Right? Why wouldn't you, if you're interested in a form of art that resists capital, why wouldn't you look at socialist art? Because socialist art is produced within a socioeconomic system that breaks the chains of imperialism and establishes an alternative cultural apparatus. Instead, what most Western Marxists do is they denigrate any form of socialist art And they elevate not only bourgeois art, but usually the most obscure forms of bourgeois art that one needs to have kind of high theoretical training in order to understand. Herbert Marcuse, who I was just talking about a moment ago, said that we can garner more at the level of art as a form of resistance from Baudelaire and Rimbaud, 19th century poets who are part of the French bourgeois canon, than from the didactic plays of Bertolt Brecht. Brecht, a socialist who was making, writing within the context of actually existing socialism, particularly when he went back to East Germany, unlike the Frankfurt School, most of the Frankfurt School scholars who went back to West Germany, funded by the Rockefellers. This is a very odd proposition, right? And on top of that, the idea is that somehow within bourgeois art, there is a promise of something that escapes the social relations of capital. And this can take different forms. I'll just highlight two examples. One is, and you'll forgive me because this is my own process of learning has led me to kind of understand Jacques Rancière, who's someone who had a big influence on me, 2 decades ago, in a very, very different light, because I see his project differently now that I think have hopefully become smarter because I've studied more and have a better sense of how bourgeois art and culture operate. What you have in the case of, I'll start with someone like Theodore Adorno and Herbert Marcuse, because Marcuse's aesthetics largely just draw on Adorno's aesthetics. And I'm going to talk in very broad terms, and if anyone's a specialist on this, then we can get into the details. But painting in broad strokes, what you have is an idea that the most powerful form of art, that art that would pose a kind of resistance to capital, is autonomous. It's autonomous mainly in its form, while recognizing that ultimately, and Adorno will say this, art is never really autonomous from its social relations. So if it's not autonomous from the socioeconomic order, why would you claim that it should be or should aspire to, or that art that does aspire to that would somehow be better? And part of this is that what he's claiming, and Marcuse is quite clear on this, is that art that aspires to autonomy is better than, superior to, art that recognizes that the socioeconomic system within which it operates has an impact on its own modalities, and therefore art is heteronomous. It's dependent upon the broader social world. So what you have in a nutshell is that art should be, in principle, autonomous or free, while in reality it is not. Keep that in mind. If we look at someone like Rancière, one of the principal arguments that he's made is that there's a form of egalitarianism that you get in what he calls the aesthetic regime of art, which is really his attempted Foucaultian theorization of the bourgeois concept and practice of art. Because that's what he primarily focuses on, is the art of the bourgeois canon as it has been canonized within the Parisian intelligentsia. And so there are elements from the socialist world, like Einstein as a filmmaker, or Bertov, or people like this, because they're part of the canonized bourgeois system, not because they actually are part of a broader socialist project. And so art, like the writings of Flaubert, who famously claimed that he could write a book on nothing, or a book on a pebble, because anything could be the subject matter of art. Art could be quintessentially egalitarian, because anything can be the subject matter of art. This is what Rancière sees in the 1850s correspondence of Flaubert. Now, that's actually quite, I could get into this in the conversation, but his interpretation of Flaubert is really forcing things. Because the reason that Flaubert says that is because he has a belief in the aristocratic power of style to elevate any commonplace object or thing to that of art. So there's actually a fundamental inequality that's baked into Flaubert's project, but Rancière invisibilizes that to focus on the claim to aesthetic equality. At the same time, Rancière will claim, if you work through all of his writings, that ultimately there is not a direct link between this kind of egalitarian form of art making in the aesthetic regime and an egalitarian politics. in that regard, it's as if there's a kind of egalitarian principle that in reality doesn't really play itself out. So this contradiction, I think, is really important to understand. You have a principled freedom and autonomy of art that's negated by the reality of its non-existence, a principled equality that's negated by its non-existence. And so in that regard, what a lot of these kind of radical theorists of art are doing is they're trafficking in a form of ideology that is actually very widespread if you diagnose it not in an aesthetic realm, but in a political realm. And liberal ideology, one of the things that it says repeatedly is it appeals to the principles of freedom, equality, fraternity, to cite the French case, and there are other instances thereof. So there's a principled freedom that is appealed to. We are all in principle free. We are all in reality, in principle equal. Sorry, but we are all in reality, within capital, very unfree and very unequal. That contradiction of liberal ideology politically is just translated into an aesthetic realm. So what we have in many ways is a liberal ideology as the very basis for a theorization, purported theorization, of radical politics and art. This whole framework then leaves us not only devoid of an understanding of an art and culture that would have, revolutionary potential, but it drives us in the direction of a belief in this kind of principled appeal to freedom and equality. Now, just in the interest of time, I would like to juxtapose that to a very different understanding of art and culture, meaning, again, the kind of positive project that undergirds the critique of the liberal ideology of these Western Marxists or Western anarchists, in the case of Rancière, and their understanding of art and culture. That is that if we want to be serious about understanding and analyzing culture, then we shouldn't and cannot do it in terms of just individual cultural productions. Look at Baudelaire, or just take a Godard film, or any other kind of point within a broader constellation. We have to look at the system that produces the artists who then produce the products, as well as the system of circulation and the system of consumption. That overall system operates in such a way that it is a force that perpetuates a particular ideology of individual production on the part of genius figures who are the isolated artists who are in touch with a higher ethereal realm and can tap into it, often transcending material reality. And then they produce these magical objects that themselves, or practices or performances, it doesn't matter exactly how they play themselves out, but something magical that then consumers can engage in as if they have a free and direct and unmediated relationship to this magical object. And all of the social relations of production, distribution, and consumption disappear. As if there wasn't finance capital behind the art world, as if there weren't very material political and state interests operative in the way in which art functions. And so a historical and dialectical materialist analysis of culture centers the system of production, distribution, and consumption, and recognizes a very fundamental thing, and that is that system under capital functions in very specific ways in order to perpetuate bourgeois ideology, the ideology of individual freedom, the atomization of society, etc. And it's very different than the attempts that have been made and continue to be made within a socialist cultural apparatus, in which art is democratized, or at least there are efforts to democratize art and decouple it from the profit motive, exchange value, and the interests of the ruling class. You see this very clearly, for instance, in the case of the Cuban revolutionary project that has centered art and culture as a real beating heart to the revolution. If you want to remake a society, you have to remake its culture. You have to change how culture functions, how it's produced, who produces it, who has access to it. There's been a massive, massive democratization of art and culture. It's not just for this petty bourgeois imperial layer that has the time and the freedom and the resources and the money to make art. It should be for everyone to develop themselves as full cultural beings. In that regard then, I want to kind of close by highlighting what I consider to be, unlike this kind of bourgeois theory of art in which you invest in cultural commodity fetishism and then try to identify a principled autonomy or principled equality within isolated objects of art, a different framework for understanding this. And I'll be relatively short on this and then we can open up for conversation and debate, is that I think that if we see culture as a site of class struggle and a major site of class struggle, because culture is what made all of us. It's how we think, it's how we feel, it's how we perceive the world, it's what we desire or find repulsive. I mean, culture is an awesome, awesome force. It's what gave me this language, you know? It's what allows us to interact. So it's an awesome force. And if you want to intervene in that forceful, it's the force that composes individuals and societies. Right? It's that which makes human beings. If you want to intervene in that in such a way that you contest the rule of capital, it's not sufficient to listen to atonal music or read Baudelaire. I think there are at least two tactics I want to highlight and one overall strategy. One tactic is that in the capitalist world, the entire system is dominated by the capitalist cultural apparatus. And an important way of relating to that is what I would refer to as a Trojan horse tactic. You want to get your message out into the broader world, but the people who own and control the means of communication, all of the platforms of communication, are capitalists. How do you do that? Well, one way of doing it is you smuggle a message into that cultural apparatus and you get it very broadly diffused. If people are familiar with the work of Boots Riley, Sorry to Bother You, his film, his TV shows, his music for that matter, Sorry to Bother You, I think, is an excellent example of a Trojan horse aesthetic intervention into a capitalist cultural apparatus. It's a film that's enormously successful, very funny. People can watch it and not get the core message, but the fundamental message in that film is that capitalism has developed itself in such a way that it has racialized and created beasts of burden, equisapiens, that are used as the underclass of the world, and that if you want to change that system, you have to seize the means of production. It's a revolutionary film across the board. That's a great example of Trojan horse art, and I think a very powerful one thereof. The problems with Trojan horse art and culture is that what you get at the level of quantity, you get access to a lot of people, but you have to make certain sacrifices in order to do it, right? You have to massage the message to some extent, otherwise you just can't get it out. So you have advantages and disadvantages. The second tactic is one of counter-hegemonic art. Counter-hegemonic art doesn't try to smuggle a message in. Counter-hegemonic art says, and then there are ways of doing both of these at the same time, of course. Counter-hegemonic art says, look, the cultural apparatus controls very powerfully everything that exists and circulates. So what we need to do is develop alternative art practices that aren't beholden to the imperatives of capital, and very importantly, and it's great that we're in this space in order to make this statement, we need infrastructure to do that. We need our own means of cultural production, distribution, and consumption that aren't simply beholden to the dictates of capital. So counter-hegemonic art is not only producing art that doesn't fit and often cannot fit within the extant capitalist system, but it's also producing, at least at a micro level, an alternative system. If people are familiar with third cinema, it's also a great example. Third cinema, around the world, I'm thinking of Latin America in particular, there are instances of, using the power of filmmaking to connect with average, everyday people who make their own films. Films are shown outside of the theaters. They're, in community centers or projected on the side of a barn. And they're sites of political education that are bringing people into a broader community of cultural class struggle. Third cinema, unlike what Solanas and Gattino called first and second cinema, is precisely this kind of form of displacement and counter-hegemonic art. Those are two important tactics in relationship to a dominant capitalist cultural apparatus, but both of them, I think, need to be tethered to, and this is the last thing that I'll say, the strategy. If you're familiar with the Marxist vocabulary, of course, a tactic is a means by which you advance towards a strategy, but the strategy is the overall goal. It's where you're headed. And you need strategic thinking and a strategic orientation, otherwise you're just, you don't know where you're headed. And tactics, if they be Trojan horse tactics or counter-hegemonic cultural practices, I think ultimately need to be tethered to the overall strategy. And if we're serious about changing culture, that means that we're actually changing the overall system by which human beings are forged in every dimension of their existence. It's a pretty big undertaking. And to do that, you can't just do it at the level of Trojan horse interventions or counter-hegemonic cultural practices. You need the full power of a state, and you need to establish a socialist cultural apparatus that allows you to transform the socioeconomic base that is undergirding the entire system of cultural production. If you are able to do that, as again the Cuban model I think clearly demonstrates, then what you do is you shift the very horizons, the material framework within which culture is produced. And you shift it out of the hands of the capitalist ruling class, and you put it in the hands of the people, mediated by the state as a protector from imperialism and a necessity in an imperialist world, because otherwise the state would be crushed. And in that regard, the overall objective, I think, of cultural class struggle needs to be the strategy of developing socialist state-building projects for a cultural apparatus that can then engage in the project that Ernesto Che Guevara referred to as the making of the new human being, right? The reforging human beings, so that we're not atomized, competitive, consumerist, careerist individuals, but instead part of a community that wants to have a much more egalitarian, autonomous, and ecologically sustainable world. So I'll leave it at that, and then we can open up for questions, conversation, criticisms, etc.
Okay, thank you. That was great. Just little information. The Chinese translators of Los Zurdos book were supposed to attend this event, but because their institution's approval to participate wasn't ready for our date, so probably we will do a later event which will be completely in Chinese, just for that. Originally we wanted it to be together, but because of that I'm having to do it with two separate events. Now I'm having maybe a couple of questions that I hope can be interesting for you, and then of course after me we have Giulio Ongaro, who is a anthropologist based here in Hong Kong, and then after that everyone else is welcome to contribute. My first question is, I see the book. By the way, I see 3 books downstairs, so please put them back later because they are for reading. And the book is called Western Marxism, but I never find satisfaction in this word Western, because it's a broad term. I'm not, of course, just talking geographically, but also there is a sentiment of structuralism with which, if I, an Italian passport holder, by birth, probably in the not periphery, not center, let's say mid neighborhoods, residential neighborhoods of the empire, in the structured sense, then whatever I do other than go out and create my own socialist state seems to be interpreted as part of the larger apparatus. And so this is my misunderstanding. I wonder if this could be a chance to contextualize much better the word Western, especially because everywhere I try to apply it, I have troubles.
Yeah.
Like tonight, I have friends here with me from Italy, from Russia, from Mexico, from Ukraine, from Hong Kong. All these places are somehow, in different ways, denying this dichotomy between capitalism versus socialism. So many times, as you perfectly explained, under the skin of Marxism, we actually bring something else, right? And you've brilliantly explained. And I wonder, sometimes under the skin of socialism, we can also bring something else. And also the use that we could make of this brilliant theory, for example, in Hong Kong, in art productions in Hong Kong, has to start from a propositive, constructive position of hope, in terms of, you know, you want to work on a project, maybe it takes you a long time, so you want to do something that can by itself be already sort of disengaged from the system that you seem to not detach from some of the productions. I'm very happy you bring the film as an example. I haven't watched that film, so I can't talk about that film, but somehow you have seen a film within the empire, probably within the center of the empire, which denies some of the descriptions. So maybe contextualizing also could mean where exactly, in which productions, and etc. Right? We have the Hollywood, I don't know, Top Gun movies, but then of course we also have other DIY, etc. kind of films. That would be my first question.
Well, I think that for me it is perhaps more coherent to talk about imperial Marxism rather than Western Marxism. Western, of course, is just a generic term, but it ultimately refers to the imperial core in the sense of the countries that are the leading forces behind imperialism as a system of underdevelopment of the planet. Historically, those have been Western Europe, but after the anti-imperialist rivalry between World War I and World War II, which is basically between Germany and the United States emerged as the leading imperialist power, and then has a whole series of junior partners. And there are a lot of subsidiaries in that process. And for that matter, those relations can be quite complex, and you have to map all of them out, right? There are also people, or I say countries, that try to have their foot a little bit in both camps in various ways, because they see, for instance, the rise of China in a multipolar world, but the continued dominance of the United States, and they're playing between the two to some extent. And all of that would be and could be mapped out in fine detail. The thing with cultural practices within a particular state, like take the United States, obviously the dominant system is one of imperial cultural production. I don't think there's any doubt about that. It could be Hollywood, but also the major art institutions in the United States are all private, unlike some of those in Western Europe, for instance, and they have a long-standing relationship to the capitalist ruling class and to the U.S. national security state. MoMA, the Met, these organizations are very deeply embedded within U.S. imperial interests, and therefore what is shown there is in accord with more or less what those dictates are. But there's a play and there's struggle. Even within capitalist institutions, there are struggles, of course, and some of them are very important struggles. Like the work of Hans Haacke, he wasn't able to show it, I think, originally at the Guggenheim, because he was critical of the Guggenheim's real estate investments, and then it was this particular project called Unfinished Business was then staged at the New Museum. Like, these types of struggles within and around bourgeois institutions can be important, just as reforms within bourgeois democracies can be important, even though they're not necessarily revolutionary. And then in the broader world, of course, there are a whole series of cultural practices and struggles that are not simply engulfed within those kind of mainstream institutions. I've been involved for years with a number of them in Philadelphia, which I could talk specifically about, but might not be of broader interest than those who might know the Philadelphia art scene. And that is all part of a broader cultural class struggle. Right? So when I say that the U.S. is an empire, it doesn't mean that I have this reductivist sense of, well, everything in the United States is just flatly reduced to this one way of producing culture. No, there's cultural class struggle at many levels within it, and obviously I'm a professor in the United States engaging in intellectual class struggle and trying to keep my job while I do it, and so obviously, I would also be, I guess, part of those struggles. Regarding socialism and whether or not there are variations within global socialist projects, no doubt. There have been conflicts and contradictions in various ways. I think that what I push very strongly against is the Western Marxist assumption that all forms of actually existing socialism are to be condemned across the board as totalitarian and just a hellscape. And at best, maybe they're not even socialists. They're just state capitalists. If you analyze and study the history of actually existing socialism, which, as far as I know, no Western Marxist has ever done in any serious manner, then you recognize that the opposite is the case. And I could give many concrete examples of that if you would like, but the fundamental thing that socialism has done is, as Lenin said, it's taken the slaves of the colonies, right? People who had almost no life expectancy, literacy rates were non-existent, no access to health care, higher education, limited if no housing, and then built them into developed societies in an incredible, incredible manner. And there are many, many examples of that. Are there perversions within the world socialist movement? For sure. I mean, we're dealing with human beings trying to do difficult things, and you have no case of socialism in the world that hasn't been subjected to the most heinous forms of imperialist destabilization. And destabilization, saying it nicely. This is, putting rat poison in milk, in children's milk for schools in Cuba, dropping bombs, like seed bombs and biological and chemical warfare in order to kill crops and not allow people to eat, terrorist attacks, burning things down, acts of arson, etc. And all of that means that, yes, socialism inherits all of the ills of capitalism, right? It's not like a country goes socialist and racism disappears, or misogyny is, oh, I'm done with that, homophobia is gone, we're new people all of a sudden. No, you actually have to develop a culture and educate people to get rid of really heinous things that have been around for a very long time, like racism, patriarchy, etc. And on top of that, you have the imperialists just pummeling you constantly. So what I find remarkable in the history of world socialism is the incredible successes. Like, why is it that Italy, well, I was going to say why isn't that Italy's not fascist today, but I should watch myself. So with Meloni and co, but let me put it more specifically. Why is it that France doesn't speak German today and instead speaks French? It's because there was a world historical defeat of fascism that was principally overseen by the Soviet Union. And if the Soviet Union had not been in existence, then that would not have happened. 80% of the German army was deployed in the East. The war was fought in the East. 27 million Soviets, 20 million Chinese gave their lives fighting fascism. That's how fascism was defeated in World War II. Socialism defeated fascism. And given that we're in a world with rising fascism, including in Italy, the United States, and unfortunately the capitalist core and many of the peripheral capitalist states, that is an enormous win for humanity and something to be celebrated. Doesn't mean that there weren't mistakes along the way or missteps and things like this, but it does mean that the categorical condemnation of socialism is condemning humanity to the true totalitarian hellscape, which is capitalism, fascism, ecological apocalypse, endless war, and unfortunately the world that we know. I don't know if that's enough, or I can...
Sure. No,
I'm excited about these things, so I can go on at night, believe me.
And then about the second part of your talk, when you speak about the relation between art and politics, and you also have another book out where you seem to be not needing the separation between art and politics altogether, or somehow they seem to be using each other to the point that they are somehow the same sort of system. Then what could be concrete ways for art practitioners? A lot of people here are actually makers. We have a lot of artists, writers, scholars. So what would you suggest as the viable alternative? Hong Kong is at the same time a very capitalist city, but also at the same time within the sphere of socialist China influence. Mm-hmm. So it's a very special case for your analysis.
Yeah, I would say that, outside of the two tactics and the one strategy that I mentioned, that one of the problems with the bourgeois concept and practice of art is it attempts to separate art from the rest of the world and say that there's this cherished magical little practice that, it's basically the channeling of religious ideology. That there's this special thing that is spiritual and ethereal, that's disconnected from material relations, and that we can have a special relationship to, and that we can't really reduce to material relations. I'm not superstitious. I don't believe in another world that is somehow disconnected from material relations. There are things that aren't material in a basic physical sense, of course, but I don't think that there are, enchanted goods and enchanted practices that are unmoored from material realities. And so, in that regard, the grounding of one's practice needs to be in the material world that we live in. And I think one of the greatest theorists of art and politics is Bertolt Brecht. And one of the positions that he took, which has been criticized by many in the Western Marxist camp, is that art is a cultural form that can communicate to people very powerfully an adequate picture of reality. Or it can confuse them. It can tell them lies. It can make them believe in things that are untrue. And it can drive them in the wrong direction. That's what bourgeois art does. Confuses people, muddies the water, makes them desire things they shouldn't. And so art, as providing an adequate picture of the real, Brecht has been criticized for this, I think, in a very simplistic manner. As if that meant that art would just be me standing here on a podium and saying, this is how the world is, and that's what you have to understand. That's not what Brecht, if you know Brecht's work, that's not what he was doing. What Brecht was doing was harnessing the full power of form. Right? And he understands form not like a formalist in the kind of painterly sense. Form is all of the modalities of communication that we have. Form is music and color and light and architecture and positioning in space and the use of language and fashion. All of that is form. And so if you want to connect with people and give them an understanding of the world, you need innovative forms, creative forms, seductive forms, things that really catch people and really bring them in and give them an adequate picture of the real. That's the power of Brechtian art, and I think it's a very adequate description. Now, that being said, some people have asked, well, what about non-figurative or non-narrative art forms? And I do think it's important that art, also a lot of art, can just be something that brings people in and creates community. If you think, for instance, in organizing in Philadelphia, one of the best things is not the speeches that are given. It's the drum team. Because if you want to protest and you want to bring people in, the drum team's where it's at. And it doesn't matter how many true things you speak on the microphone, the drum team sets the rhythm and brings people in. So art can also operate at the level of sense perception. It can create community, bring people in, make them part of a vital community, make them excited, make them fucking angry. Art can do that. It can run through a whole series of emotions. It can make people desire something. It can make people connect with their fellow human beings from whom they're isolated. That's an incredible force. But that, I think, has to then operate at the level of understanding, where the reason to bring them in, the reason to grab them by the entrails, is to give them an understanding, to situate them in the world and say, this is where you are in the world, and this is global class struggle, and you're part of it. You are part of it, and you're making decisions right now about what side you're on and where this world is headed. And the highest level, right, you go from sense perception to understanding, the highest level in this, I'm interpreting Brecht and pushing him a little bit, but I think it's implicit within his work, is practical reasoning. You can understand the world and not be able to change it. And that form of defeatism doesn't get us anywhere. What you need is understanding linked with practical reason, so you clearly identify how it is that you transform the world. Anyone familiar with Brecht's plays, it's never just, okay, these are the capitalists, and this is how racism works, and this is how misogyny works. There's all of that there. But there's also a very clear elucidation of these are the forces that can change that world that has screwed all of these people over. And so, for me, the best forms of art do all of that. Sense perception, understanding, and practical reason. And that's very different than the kind of bourgeois aesthetic approach to art, in which often it's the beautiful soul approach, where this is really powerful because I have an intimate spiritual relationship to it. but I can't explain it, and I don't know how it's related to the material world, and it certainly can't change anything, but I can indulge in it. So that would be my answer in a nutshell.
Great. And there are two elements, and I promise this is my last question. There are two elements I wanted to just define more. The first is when you talked about fetish before, and then now when you talk about channeling of religion.
Yeah.
But I find nothing wrong with spiritualism, with religion, with fetish. Of course, not in the sense you were talking about, sure, no problem. But then there is that kind of magic. There is that kind of spontaneous appearance of community sometimes, or understanding in the artistic, aesthetic encounter, which has some kind of sublime quality, even if only sensorially. And I wonder if the materialist approach is reductive of that, because that sometimes can be surprisingly helpful also to wake up, or take a step back from the system that tries to camouflage itself.
Yeah. It's a good question. I think it would be helpful to distinguish between a kind of religious and superstitious interpretation of spirit, if you will, on the one hand, which ultimately, religion was the dominant ideology under feudalism, and as capitalism emerged, a lot of religious ideology was just transferred to culture, and culture in the sense of art, theory, etc. And so that I'm very critical of, because I think that it is ultimately inverting and obscuring the real nature of the world. That being said, and this is the distinction that I would make, is that if we talk about spirit as something like a collective force rooted in material struggles, and things that are elements of human existence that we can't fully explain, but that are palpable because we've all had these types of experiences, then, or hopefully have had some semblance of them, then I don't think it would be a matter of just kind of reducing everything to materialism in a really brute sense of like physical existence or something like that. What I understand by materialism is it is also including all of the elements of human existence, right? So desire, fantasy, these are things that they can be made palpable and physical, but they have a dimension to them that often are not. And so for me, art and culture is powerful insofar as it connects to all of the different dimensions of human existence, but doesn't stray off into superstitious la-la land, if that makes sense. Like music would be a good example of it. I think that if there is, like most human beings, and it's actually a material history that is this, the reason that we feel certain things, and it's relatively generalized, when we hear music, is because of the historicity of our material existence, the development of our auditory capacities, and the development of different instruments and things like this. So ultimately this is rooted in a very material history, but it pulls at us and it beats with us because of that history, but it's not, it's not a flat materialism or a flattened materialism. And like the land of emotion, right? It's not that emotions can all be reduced to something that's physical, right? But emotions themselves are rooted in material relations. And so basically, I know I'm meandering around this a little bit because it's a complicated question. What I would like to do is highlight the difference between a kind of materially driven forces that we can all feel through emotion on the one hand, and then the superstitious kind of baggage of religious ideology on the other that I think just obscures things and doesn't actually help. So a materialist account of sensibility and emotion, yes, but a superstitious one, no, in a nutshell.
Okay.
Okay, I've been singled out for some reason, but anyway, thanks for the eloquent talk. I have a couple of questions on, one is on the emergence of Western Marxism. I was wondering, to what extent do you think it's a sort of a intentional move by the ruling class in imperial court to hijack Marxism, so an intentional move, or whether it's more an outgrowth of the structure where the causative links are sort of more subtle and clear. I mean, you mentioned Marcuse had a link to the CIA, but how widespread is that sort of direct link? I guess that was one question. The other question that I have is that I know that there's a significant contingent of activists in the West, at least, who would probably agree with Losurdo on the negative critique of Western Marxism, but they would shy away from sort of supporting Eastern socialism, and probably mean a lot of anarchists who, for example, would see a successful movement more like the Zapatista or the Kurds rather than China.
Yeah.
Do you think they're also being co-opted by this kind of sort of system, or are they just misguided, or what's your take on that?
Yeah.
I have other questions. Let's start with it.
Well, I can also be shorter in my responses because I'd love to hear what your other thoughts and other people's thoughts. So I can be rather quick. I think that Western Marxism it's both and, meaning that it has historically been driven by the socioeconomic base. And this is part of Losurdo's argument, right, that it's the labor aristocracy and the imperial core that lined up on the bourgeoisie against the proletarian revolutions from the periphery. And that's really the driving force behind the ideology of Western Marxism. But the superstructure, meaning this kind of cultural apparatus, has also fostered Western Marxism as a useful ideological weapon of war against actually existing socialism. And the Marcuse example is one among a number of others, because the Rockefellers were also funding and supporting Adorno and Horkheimer, and the Congress for Cultural Freedom was a CI front organization that also funded and supported. So there's other evidence on that front, but it's both at the same time. Anarchism, long and complex history, there are different types of and movements within anarchism, but in general, if you look at the struggles on the imperialist side, and what the imperialists are trying to do is shore up belief in capital and eliminate the socialist alternative. And so anarchists are considered a threat to the capital order at a certain level, but they have also often been considered very useful enemies. Meaning, anarchists have also been supported and mobilized against Marxists who support actually existing socialism. Because depending on the version of anarchism, many anarchists are anti-party, so they don't want people to get organized in political parties, and they're anti-state. What that means is that if you're to fight against imperialism, and you do it without getting organized, and without getting state power, it's basically like, I don't know, a football game, or I shouldn't use a football metaphor, I don't know what, a soccer match, right? Where you have on the one side, a really highly trained, organized team with a coach. On the other, people who don't really practice, and there's no coach, and there's no plans, and there's no order, and everybody can just kind of kick the ball around as they see fit. So who's going to win the soccer match? It's pretty clear. And so that team is pretty beneficial to the team that wants to win, and sometimes is very strongly supported by them.